You need to understand the iPad gestures if we want to add any gestures to the MyPad World app for the iPad. People use their fingers, of course, to select and manipulate objects. The moves that do the work, which are called gestures, give the user a heightened sense of control and intimacy with the device. No sample iPad app would be complete without some gesture control, because with an iPad you have a large display that begs to be tapped, pinched, or even swiped. But the thing about an iPad is that you also have to make the user interface large enough for tapping. You have enough screen real estate to do that, much more than on the iPhone, so your buttons and your tapped items are going to be much bigger. Now, there are several standard gestures available that you already know from the iPhone. You can tap, which is to press or select something, like a single mouse click. You can drag, which is scroll or pan, move side by side. You can flick, which is to scroll or pan quickly. You can swipe, which is like a flick, but in a table view row, it reveals a delete button. You can double tap, which is to zoom in and display a block of content or an image in the center, or double tap to zoom out if you've already zoomed in. As you learn with the iPhone app, we put in a pinch open or an unpinch in order to bring up our flip side view. Usually, an unpinch will do a zoom in, and a pinch close will do a zoom out. And then there's also the touch and hold, which is also known as a long touch or a long press. And when editing text, it shows a magnified view of editable text for cursor positioning, but there are other uses for it as well. The iPad offers a few more gestures you can do due to its larger display. You can have true multi-finger, multi-touch gestures, such as two-finger swipes, or three-finger twirls, or two different hands. These are all gestures that weren't really possible on the iPhone's tiny screen. For example, in touch hockey, you can have two players, two different fingers. In GarageBand, you can use multiple fingers to play chords on a guitar. In apps like Keynote, you can drag multiple slides using two hands. Of course, the only problem I see with two-hand gestures is that on a table, the original iPad might wobble too much because of its curved back. So that would leave only your legs as proper support for two-handed gestures. But that problem goes away with the sleeker iPad 2. So you see lots of touch, hold, swipes, and flicks in iPad apps more than iPhone apps. And of course, two-finger and even three-finger gestures. With all the user elements and layers of user interface, it helps to use gestures to distinguish what type of motion action you're trying to engage. To offer a finer grain of control over what happens when fingers touch the display, you can use a delegate of the UI Gesture Recognizer class that recognizes gestures and customizes their actions. This class defines a set of common behaviors that can be configured for all gesture recognizers, and it can also communicate with its delegate, which is an object that adopts the UI Gesture Recognizer Delegate protocol. So with a Gesture Recognizer object, you can separate the logic for recognizing a gesture from the action that should occur. When one of these objects recognizes a common gesture, or in some cases a change in the gesture, it sends an action message to each of the designated target objects. So a UI Tap Gesture Recognizer, for example, looks for a single or multiple taps. You can set the number of taps required in the number of taps required property. That's the number of taps required for the gesture to be recognized. And you can also set the number of touches required to set the number of fingers required to tap for the gesture to be recognized. And your action methods that are handling a, say, multiple touch gesture can get the location of the gesture as a whole by calling the UI Gesture Recognizer method called Location in View. And if there are multiple taps, this location is the first tap. And if there are multiple touches, this location is the centroid of all fingers tapping the view at once. You can even get locations of the particular touches in the multi-finger tap by calling the Location of Touch in View method. We also have the UI Swipe Gesture Recognizer, which looks for swiping gestures in one or more directions. And you can also set the number of touches required property for that, as well as the direction property. And you, of course, have the UI Pinch Gesture Recognizer, looking for pinching gestures involving two touches. As you know, when the user moves the two fingers toward each other, the conventional meaning is zoom out. When the user moves two fingers away from each other, the conventional meaning is zoom in. We also have the UI Pan Gesture Recognizer, which looks for panning or dragging gestures. A user must be pressing one or more fingers on a view while they pan it. You can implement an action method for this gesture recognizer that can ask it for the current translation and velocity of the gesture. In your action methods, you can also specify the view whose coordinate system should be used for the translation and velocity values. The UI Rotation Gesture Recognizer is often used for iPad apps. It looks for rotation gestures involving two touches. When the user moves fingers opposite each other in a circular motion, the underlying view should rotate in a corresponding direction and speed. So a rotation begins when two touches have moved enough to be considered a rotation. Of course, you can set that property. And the gesture changes when a finger moves while the two fingers are down. It ends when both fingers have lifted. And of course, at each stage in the gesture recognizer sends its action message so that you can move the underlying view. Now, the UI long press gesture recognizer looks for the long press, or also known as long touch, or the touch and hold. The user has to press one or more fingers on a view for at least a specified period of time for the action message to be sent. Of course, you can set that period of time in a property. The fingers may move only a specified distance for the gesture to be recognized. If they move beyond this limit, the gesture fails, because really, if it moves, it's probably more like a swipe than a long touch. So yeah, you have the properties number of touches required to figure out whether it really is a long press, and the minimum press duration so that you can figure out whether it's been touched for a long enough period of time. You even have the allowable movement property to figure out whether the touch has moved beyond the allowable range of movement during the long press. So I strongly suggest that you use the standard gestures in your app as they were designed to be used. Even so, the iPad's multi-touch hardware and software let you go beyond standard gestures when appropriate. Because you can monitor the movement of each finger to detect gestures, you can create your own, but use that capability sparingly, only when it's undoubtedly the right thing to do in your application, such as in GarageBand. You couldn't possibly be playing the guitar with multiple fingers without that kind of capability.